What is up, everybody? Welcome to the 4for Formula One podcast and this week's Imola GP Recap. As always, I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com, with my co-host, Dan Weiner, the senior producer at BetSperts. Before we get into everything today, just want to remind everybody that 4for4 has teamed up with Run the Sims for projections, tools, and content for both F1 and USFL DFSN betting. So if you haven't signed up yet, go over to runthesims.com or check out the link in the description and use the promo code 4for4 for 10% off USFL and F1 offerings. If you didn't know or you haven't been paying attention, Run the Sims founder Justin Freeman did chop first place this week in the big F1 GPP, so we'll definitely be getting into that. But before we get there, Dan, how are you?
I'm great, man. Good, maybe not the most exciting race for like 4/5 of it, but
Yeah.
an interesting race. A lot of things to kind of like sink your teeth into from just a storyline standpoint, from a betting standpoint, from a DFS standpoint. So we've had 4 races, and even if they haven't necessarily at times been like the most thrilling wheel-to-wheel racing, all of them have been interesting in some form or fashion. So it's a good weekend, and it's fun to be back and talking about it.
Yeah, the one consistent thing we've had is, at the very least, exciting in midfield, even if we haven't had a ton of battles up front, except for, I think, the first week, Max and Charles were battling it out a bit. But Max's full boom or bust. If he doesn't finish, if he finishes, he's winning. If he doesn't win, he's just retiring the car. But we've had some exciting midfield every single week, and that's why DFS and betting is fun, because we get to really pay attention to that midfield. But let's talk a little bit about the race and things that stood out to you.
Yeah, like last week, complete dominance at the top for the second week in a row. This time, Max Verstappen, who, if you watch the sprint race, he struggled out of the gate.
Yep.
And that race did not. He got off to a great start, and that was basically all she wrote at the top of the race. When we had the race 2 weeks ago in Australia, Leclerc, there was one stretch where Verstappen kind of made a charge at him and Leclerc held him off, and then it was over. None of that on Sunday. Max Verstappen, for the second week in a row, we had a Grand Slam, which, again, if you haven't followed, that is qualifying in first, fastest lap of the race, leading every lap of the race and winning the race, and throw on top of it that he won the sprint. I think we can call that the Max Slam.
The Max Slam. I was going to ask, do we have a name for the
Max
sprint?
Slam is what I think we're going to call it.
Right.
First time we've had back-to-back Grand Slams in a season since 2013. Fourth time ever, but just the second since 1963, and the first ever by 2 different drivers in consecutive weeks. But behind Max, man, that first lap was chaotic. Daniel Ricciardo got into Carlos Sainz and wrecked Carlos Sainz out of the race. So for the second week in a row, Carlos Sainz finished his day was over within the first 2 laps of the race. Behind them, Mick Schumacher got into Fernando Alonso, which messed up both of their days. On the 6th lap, the damaged side pod of Alonso's car just fell off.
That was crazy. He just barely got bumped, and there was a little bit of a dent, and that dent turned into a hole the size of half of his car, basically.
Second time this year that's happened to an Alpine car. It happened in practice to Ocon, but that one, it just kind of happened. This one, he got a wheel on the side of his car, and that will happen. Sainz and Alonso, the only 2 drivers though who didn't finish the race. George Russell was the biggest beneficiary of the collision on the first lap. He moved from 11th to 6th right out of the gate. Again, George Russell making the most of what he has. The race director felt track was too moist for DRS through most of the race, so it was basically fairly uneventful for the most of the rest of the race. Valtteri Bottas chased Russell. That was a pretty interesting battle for a lot of the time. Of course, the former Mercedes driver against the guy who replaced him. Yuki Tsunoda had a great race as well. And it seemed like the final notable thing that happened in the race was going to be the final indignity in the crap week that it was for Lewis Hamilton, when the guy who he battled tooth and nail last year for the title, Max Verstappen, lapped Lewis Hamilton in this race. And that was miserable for Hamilton. And it seemed like that was it until it wasn't, when Ferrari with Leclerc in third place. Leclerc got off to a bad start. He fell from 2nd to 4th, battled back into 3rd. They opted to put him into the pits to put soft tires on to try to see if he could get 2nd or the fastest lap. But all that did was inspire Red Bull to do the same thing with both of their cars. On lap 53, Leclerc was chasing Perez, but he got into the chicane, spun out into the wall, was able to save the car, fell back into ninth, was able to battle back for a sixth place finish, but pretty miserable end to the day for Ferrari. Verstappen and Sergio Perez finished 1-2 for Red Bull, a dominating performance for them, their first 1-2 finish since 2016. Lando Norris sneaks his way onto the podium again at Imola. Russell finished fourth, Bottas fifth, Leclerc sixth, Tsunoda seventh. Kevin Magnussen was ninth, sandwiched by Sebastian Vettel and Lance Stroll, finishing eighth and 10th, getting Aston Martin their first points of the season. And then the aforementioned Lewis Hamilton down there in 13th. As you can see here, just to kind of give you a sense of the movement on the grid, that's kind of what it looks like. And when 4 of the top 10 drivers on the grid to start the race are the bottom 4 finishers, there's going to be a lot of movement. And there you see Russell climbing 7 spots, Tsunoda and Vettel, Stroll, Ocon 5, Albon 6, Gasly 4, like just crazy when you look at it. And then look, there's Nicholas Latifi, 3 points, which is a bonus, isn't it?
Yeah, for he got that.
It's a 2-point bonus.
He got a couple points despite finishing behind Albon again. But
his biggest points all of the season, probably, right?
Yeah, I think he's only been negative or 0, and it was actually funny. You mentioned on Twitter, like even with a 0, he was in one of the winning lineups. So we'll get into some of the DFS implications of what happened from the race, but just from a general standpoint, I think it was a really great microcosm of why, if you are involved in betting or DFS, it does make the race really exciting, because even though up front, if you're tuning in, it might have seemed like a somewhat boring, uneventful race. And we could talk a little bit about what we thought about the DRS not getting implemented for so long because of the rain. But having that action up front at the beginning, with Ricciardo, with Sainz, 2 of the most popular constructors in DFS are obviously always going to be Ferrari, and the McLaren is very popular with starting 5-6 on the grid. So within seconds of the race starting, everybody that has Ferrari or McLaren constructors like almost drawing dead. Obviously there's tons of race to go, a lot of stuff can happen, but your hopes of having a great day are instantly dashed. And then just so many lineup combos end up changing that much when Perez falls that far back. When Sainz falls back, ends up not finishing. So many wrenches get thrown in the lineup, and it's really fun. And then look at Aston Martin; they finish in the points. We think they're a team that is right there with Williams as the worst team, and then all of a sudden they get double points. So I think it makes it exciting from a viewer perspective, because it looks like we might have a top 3 team now. It looks like McLaren kind of might be in their own tier with Mercedes struggling again, even though Russell just, he's Mr. Consistent. It seems like McLaren probably is that 3, but I mean, on a week-to-week basis, teams 4 through 9, it's really anybody's guess. So that makes it fun for watching, for betting, for DFS. And then you mentioned the Max Verstappen lapping Lewis Hamilton. Nico Rosberg was having some fun with that one. They had him on the announcers table from time to time. And for those that don't know, he used to be teammates with Lewis Hamilton, and they had a pretty tumultuous relationship, switching off drivers' championships while they were with Mercedes. So you heard a little bit of joy in his voice when he talked about Max lapping Lewis.
Yeah, one of the funniest things and I wish I had come up with this joke, but one of the kind of jokes, and I actually the more I think about it, wonder if there is some truth to this, but was presented as a joke, that a lot of people have suggested that George Russell is having a much better season than Lewis Hamilton because he's used to driving a crappy Williams car, and now he's driving a crappy Mercedes car. And Lewis Hamilton's never driven a bad car in his career.
Yeah.
And he's struggling. And I mean, it's a joke, but it's one of those things where I'd love to talk to someone who's way more versed in this stuff than you and I are, to be like, okay, it's presented as a joke, but how much reality is there in this? And that's a good point that you make about like some of these midfield teams. And I think we see in a race where there's some chaos, and like you said, we'll dive into nuts and bolts specifics of some of this stuff. But you see drivers who started 11th, 12th, and 13th all end up well into the points in this race. And I think when you start to just, as an overarching kind of thought about this, you're probably going to need to start targeting those kinds of drivers. Maybe the idea that this guy starts and he's not in a great car and he starts 11th or 12th and he's going to fall back. Maybe that's not the best philosophy. Like I mentioned, and I'll take the L on it now. Like I was concerned with Bottas because he's usually a guy who qualifies fast and then maybe doesn't perform well in the race. He had an issue in the pits where his, like, for whatever reason, like once a year, Bottas has just a misfortune in the pits. And if not for that, like he probably could have passed Russell and could have maybe even pushed Norris. Like he might have had the third fastest car of anyone who finished the race, but he ended up losing like 10 seconds in the pits. But yeah, I mean, it was a really fascinating race. And when you get that wreck on the first lap, that takes out 4 of the top 10 drivers, you're going to have some kind of fun variance. And you end up with a DFS lineup that was kind of, I think, unexpected. I mean, I think we both were not expecting the lineup to win that did. And, from the betting perspective, some of my hunches ended up coming true. I don't know if they were great ideas or not, but there were thoughts that I had kind of going in. So it's interesting. And thankfully to all of this stuff, I've kind of gotten more invested in the midfield and what happens in the back of the pack, where I think the hardest thing for me before, look, I'll admit, like, I've watched Formula One here and there. Drive to Survive is what really got me really into it. And the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around as an American sports fan in particular is like winning is everything. And so often, particularly in the years where Lewis Hamilton was just dominating year in, year out, was that, okay, Lewis Hamilton gets the lead and then the race is over. And this race at the top was very uneventful. Like we said, like Verstappen was never at any point challenged in this race, but there were still a lot of really interesting things, and you can kind of latch on to people. I love Yuki Tsunoda. So like, I was really happy to see him race well, and respect the legacy of a guy like Vettel. Finishing 8th was awesome. And Haas, the American team, again, getting points. Like, just a fun kind of thing to dig your teeth, to sink your teeth into this week.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Bottas struggles in the pits, and again, if you're just watching without any action on it, he didn't even end up losing a place. Obviously, he fell back behind. I think it was just Russell at the time. I think I don't know if Lando was in front of him yet. It might have been Russell and Norris. But like you said, like his car was good. He easily could have finished 3rd in that race. Yeah. But if you have DFS action, like I'm laying in my bed at 6:30 in the morning screaming at the TV because like all of my lineups that need him to finish ahead of Norris and Russell just are screwed in that bad pit stop. So again, if you're just watching and you're still a Drive to Survive fan, that might seem kind of interesting, but he doesn't lose a place or whatever. If you're playing DFS, like a third of your lineups are all of a sudden dead because of that little pit stop. So I think it makes it super fun. The big, I guess, controversy from the race was them not enabling DRS for so long, because when there is rain, they don't enable it, but it was pretty damn dry for a long time, and the announcers were talking about it a lot. I don't know how many people would have noticed it if they weren't bringing it up so much, but they even asked Christian Horner about it, and I think you could make the case that I mean, Max was so good all weekend that I don't think it would have made a huge difference, but there was a short period there where Charles would have been within striking distance of DRS, so that could have at least made a little bit of the battles up front. So that was a interesting thing, with so much emphasis on the new cars and then wanting more battles in terms of overtaking, and they kind of stripped that opportunity away yesterday.
Yeah, I'm not really sure, like, personally, how it really works in terms of like the mechanics of the race director saying these are the absolute conditions. I'm assuming it's just at the discretion of the race director. So, and we have seen much less of the race director. And I think after the controversy last year at the end of the season, we're just not going to see much of the race director. Like, Michael Massey is the name of the race director from last year. I think people are going to remember that name for a long time. I think they're going to try to keep the name of the race director out of public consciousness for much of the race. Like, I don't think it would have affected things at the top of the race. I think what we saw was just that Verstappen and Perez were so much faster than Leclerc that, had, like, Leclerc was gaining on Perez, and had he not made that mistake, he would have passed him probably, but Perez would have just been able to use DRS and pass him again. And I think just, it's kind of like what we saw in Saudi Arabia with Max and Charles, is that they were kind of trading back and forth, but Max had the faster car. I think we would have seen something similar to that. I still I'm still on the fence about whether or not I think Ferrari made the right decision to pit Leclerc. Like in hindsight, obviously it's like, oh, well, that was a mistake.
Yeah.
And I think it was a mistake to do it. I just don't think that they were going to be able to, the benefit of that wasn't going to outweigh the risk and what ended up actually happening and losing points. Personally, I kind of think they should have just been like, we'll take third place. We'll lick our wounds here and we'll head to Miami and just try to regroup. I respect going for it at a certain point, but I don't know if that was the right strategy. But the DRS wasn't able at that point, and I do think like we could have seen a good battle there between Leclerc and Perez towards the end. But I still just think that Perez would have ended up beating him.
Yeah, I guess from going forward, it's a good thing for us as fans because a week ago we were talking about the mathematics of the drivers' championship and Leclerc having it all but locked up. And now all of a sudden they're right back into a battle. If Max gets another W, especially if Leclerc misses a podium, we really got a battle going. And I think with the constructors, with Sergio just looking so much better than Sainz, and it's definitely some bad luck for Sainz, but that Red Bull constructor is going to be right there with them. Anything stand out to you in terms of surprises? You kind of touched on some of the guys like Yuki, but it was cool to see some of the guys up top. I really enjoyed the Yuki. And I mean, say what you will about Stroll, it's cool to see a team like Aston Martin doing good, especially with Seb on that team.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think just seeing cars like Bottas, seeing Tsunoda, Vettel, and Stroll and look at it's AlphaTauri to Aston Martins, a Haas. Like you see a Mercedes out, you see a Ferrari out that wrecked, you see an Alpine, like Lewis Hamilton's nowhere to be found. So it was cool just seeing Yuki Tsunoda that fast in the race is always exciting. I just would love to see Yuki Tsunoda in like a faster car because I just love his potential. He's still young and he's still learning a lot about like how to be a Formula One driver. Absolutely. Even after a year, but that was really surprising to me. That was fun to see. Otherwise surprises, like I'm not sure I will, and I know we'll get into it in the DFS, and it's not just because I kind of thought this could happen. Just you got to give George Russell credit again for once again that car stings.
Yeah,
compared to the top end cars like Ferrari and Red Bull. But every week he's managing to get the most that he can out of it. And I mean, a lot of people have said, oh, well, he's just getting lucky week in and week out. And there's certainly an element of that. Like there's a wreck on the first lap that allows him the first lap of the race to gain 5 places. But look, man, luck is where opportunity meets preparation, right? Like he's had these opportunities and he's done really well. And I kind of want to see him stop. And I like Lewis Hamilton a lot, don't get me wrong, but I kind of want to stop seeing him be so differential to Lewis Hamilton when it's clear, like based on performance, he's the best Mercedes driver this year, at least through the first 4 races. So
yeah, it's gonna be super interesting to see what Mercedes does going forward from a team perspective. Like there's no reason if the car is getting better at this point, I don't know if they're gonna have team orders to let Hamilton be ahead at this point. It just doesn't matter. So that's going to be fun to watch. I mean, it's probably super reactionary, but people are already talking about, is Lewis going to retire after this year? If he is, like, mid-season. What's the motivation or whatever. So I think that's probably just a reach. We're always going to get that kind of discussion in sports with guys like Lewis, especially with the age. But from a betting and DFS perspective too, it's going to be interesting to see how they adjust. And I mean, Lewis, obviously, one of the biggest disappointments of the year, of the week, especially with Russell doing so well. Any other disappointments for you? I know one of the midfield teams that we've been on the past few weeks had a pretty crappy week in Italy.
Which one might that be?
Alpine.
Yeah, look, they've had some reliability issues all year. Like they've had some issues with the car. It's hard to say. Like Ocon. Like, could Fernando Alonso have been one of the drivers in that 5 to 10 range had Mick Schumacher not gotten into him? Like, maybe, I don't know. Like, maybe Mick Schumacher's a guy who, because when I think about like, okay, I want to see Yuki Tsunoda in a better car. Okay, what possibility might exist? Lewis Hamilton is regardless of what it is, like he's just guys don't drive past 35, 36, 37 very often.
Right.
And so he's only going to be on the grid for a couple of more years. It's going to open up a seat at Mercedes. Do they go after Lando Norris? Who do they go after? Daniel Ricciardo is probably going to retire soon. And you'd have to assume that Mick Schumacher is somebody that people are going to want in a good car at some point, given that he's royalty, like he's the son of the legend in Formula One, but he has not really shown anything. And Haas has shown they've got some pace. Like last year was a lost year for Haas. We know that. But this year, Magnussen has come back in and been great. Schumacher starts 10th in this race and immediately wrecks and did finish the race, but was nowhere to be found. So that was disappointing. And I think like ultimately one point that I did want to make about the title chase, because I think you can list Ferrari as having a really disappointing day, although the wreck, as opposed to what happened in Australia where Sainz made a mistake, this was just not his fault. Daniel Ricciardo admitted that it was his fault, but like, you know, if it had been Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen, who had been as far up after 3 races the way Leclerc was, we would have been like, oh, well, nice title chase. We'll see you next year, like that, and so on and so forth. But Ferrari hasn't won a title in a long time. They haven't had a driver win the Drivers' Championship in a long time. Clearly, Leclerc's never been in this position before, and you're going to start to see, you know, are those nerves going to be a thing? We're going to learn like a lot about what he has as a driver early on in the season under optimal conditions where he had a better car than Verstappen. He looked really calm and really cool, but made a mistake on the track that cost him 3 grid spots yesterday. And that can end up mattering later, because when Max Verstappen finishes races, he's like, I saw something, and I think it was something along the lines of like in his last like 30 races that he's finished, like where he's actually finished, like he's been first or second in all of them, but like 2. Like Max Verstappen is so good when he stays on the track, and now he's coming for Leclerc's, and Leclerc's never been in this spot. So it's really exciting, and it's great that it's flipped and it's not Leclerc giving chase to Verstappen. It kind of adds some drama to what to expect as we move forward.
Yeah, and this is like when you see, if you're a new F1 fan, like you talked about, now that hopefully this championship race is just going to keep getting closer and closer. It's why you'll see these teams have these late race strategies where they're trying to steal a fastest lap point. And we saw it last year going into the last race of the season. Lewis and Max are tied in points. So, I mean, those one single points can make a difference. Losing 3 grid positions in a single race, that makes a huge difference. And obviously you don't want to have something like Verstappen where you're having multiple races where you're retiring your car. But those things are really fun, just from not a DFS, not a betting perspective, just from a fan, the excitement of the season. Those are things that are really exciting to pay attention to. But let's jump into the DFS review portion of the show, probably why most of you are tuning in here. And we did the preview show together, so our strategy going in is probably going to be very similar to each other's and to what we talked about on Saturday. But going into the week, what was kind of your prep looking like? What was your main lineup decisions leading into Sunday morning?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when we talked about it on the show, it was like there were a lot of cheap option midfield guys who were worth playing. We talked about both Aston Martin guys being worth playing, and to something to a varying degree, they both really were, both finishing in the points. I thought maybe both of the Haas cars would be options as well. It turned out to be not so much the case with Schumacher. Again, was building mostly lineups with Verstappen and Leclerc as my captain, but I felt, and it's played out that way, that you would want to lean more towards Verstappen than Leclerc. I've loved the idea of, you know, if you're going to play Lando Norris, play him as a captain. And, you know, he finished third and basically reached his ceiling projection. You know, the only guy who, like, I feel like I whiffed on in terms of what I was expecting was Bottas, who I was a little bit worried might not match what he did in the sprint, and he ended up doing better. But yeah, I mean, I think overall, I think we were kind of all over it. It just ended up being so much variance because, like we mentioned before, 4 of the top 10 guys to start the race were the bottom 4 drivers. So it was a good week to kind of spray some of the, like, Lando Norris was just a great play, even as a driver. Like, we didn't expect there to be a scenario where playing Lando Norris just as a driver instead of your captain was going to be a winning strategy, and it turned out that was the case.
Yeah, and it's why from a strategy perspective, and if you are turning into the to the strategy show, why it can sometimes be tough for us to know exactly what our lineups are going to look like or how we're going to fit these pieces into our puzzle, because the qualifying happens. We have barely 24 hours to turn, less than 24 hours to turn over qualifying to the race and get lineups in. So we're doing the show usually before we started building lineups. So on the surface, when we just kind of thought about it logically, looking at Lando's salary, it didn't make much sense to, at least we thought it didn't make much sense to play him if he wasn't in the captain. And that was probably our big whiff from the show. But if you looked at it after you started building lineups, how well he fit in as if just let's say a Max or even a Charles lineup as a captain. The way to make those lineups contrarian this week, and we'll get into this more when we look at the winning lineups, was to have a mid-salary build outside of Max or Charles, and Lando actually fit that really nicely. Didn't realize that before the show. After I started building, realized that a little bit more. But something that really stood out to me in prep, when we were on the show on Saturday, the Run the Sims projections came out as we were live, and something that was really surprising was a couple things that I think we've noticed over the first 3 races in DFS was that we were kind of treating Red Bull and Ferrari as like 1A, 1B, whether it be Max and Charles or just as a constructor. Something that really popped to me was how much we were weighting Red Bull as the constructor over Ferrari, and how much we had Max as the very obvious captain. And that combo obviously ended up working. We'll get into that, but it was dominating how much more you should have Max in your captain if you were paying attention to the optimal rates in the Sims. And then a couple things we talked about. We wanted to be, you kind of mentioned Haas, Williams, not Alfa Romeo, but Aston Martin. Those cheap teams wanted to be heavy on a lot of those guys because we expected there to be big gaps in the ownership, and we can kind of work in both drivers from those lower salary teams because you are chasing those plus 5s. And then we loved Bottas and Yuki. Bottas was in a ton of lineups. Yuki Tsunoda surprisingly didn't have very high ownership. He was cheap and starting way ahead of Gasly, so that was one of the bigger surprises. But we were all over Yuki, so if you used him, obviously you had a very good day. That was exciting. And then pretty much standard stack and salary stuff that we're going to talk about every week. We're always just going to kind of have our normal mix of Red Bull and Ferrari stacks and trying to be contrarian in those lineups to a fair amount, mixing up our constructor captain stacks, like not using them in 100% of lineups, even though we do keep seeing them at the top. You need to give yourself some outs when that doesn't work. And then the big thing was just McLaren. We had a lot of, hopefully a lot of Lando if you were paying attention to the show. Unfortunately, a lot of McLaren constructor if you were listening to the show, but that's just kind of the way the ball bounces. Anything else before we get into what actually worked on the week?
So one of the points that I wanted, and this will kind of be a lead into it, because you mentioned Yuki's ownership was lower than you expected. And when TJ posted the winning lineups for all 4 races this year and where the ownerships were, it was like 17% ownership for Yuki.
Yeah, Yuki was 17 yesterday,
which was crazy to me. And I get it. So I did some digging on a couple of things. So Gasly last year beat Yuki head to head 17 of the 22 races, but how much of that can you chalk up to Yuki being a rookie and Gasly being a guy who's been around the circuit for a while? Yeah, like I think people probably see that number and think, okay, well, yeah, I mean, he's usually finishing behind Gasly, so maybe I'll stay away from it. So I did some more digging. And so through 4 races this year, teammates who start 3 or more grid spots higher than their teammate are 12-8 head to head, but 4 of the losses were because of either a wreck or issues with the car. And then 2 of them were just 3 spot differences between teammates. And one of them was Verstappen against Perez in Australia or in Saudi Arabia. So by and large, if a guy's got a 3 or more grid spot advantage on his teammate, he's going to win most of the time unless his car blows up. So it was just wild to me when you posted that Yuki was that low owned. Yeah. And I know his salary was higher than, say, was much higher than like a Vettel or an Albon, but it was still workable. Like, it wasn't one that it was going to keep, like, Yuki was going to be the guy to keep you from having, like, you could have Charles, Max, and I think Red Bull and Yuki and still, like, put good lineups together with Yuki in them. And so was very surprised. That was kind of the thing when you posted that surprised me the most, at least in terms of like numbers coming out of this.
Yeah, and I believe I don't have it in front of me, but I'm pretty sure we actually had Yuki projected for only about 20% ownership. I could try to look it up here real quick, but while I'm looking it up, just from a DFS perspective, yeah, we had him projected for 20% ownership. So if you don't know anything about Formula One, just from a DFS perspective, if all you know about F1 DFS is the scoring system and the salaries, if you look at a driver that's starting 5 grid positions ahead, that is $2,400 cheaper and is only going to be in 17 to 20% of lineups, like, that's just an edge that we're going to try to push every single time. If, I'm going to have 40% of Yuki in my lineups in those situations. If it doesn't hit, it doesn't hit. But like, when we talk about finding edges in DFS, that's like, an edge like that is just insane. I would almost argue it's more of an edge than like these situations where we have an Albon and Latifi, and Albon's double the ownership. Like, you want some Latifi there, but the percentage of times you're gonna hit on that is probably lower than you would like, but there's still ownership edge. But when you have just a gross ownership error by the field, that's something I really want to push. So I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, and by the way, Latifi head-to-head with Russell last year, he only won 6. So actually one more head-to-head than Yuki did against Gasly last year, but Latifi was not a rookie. So
yeah. Let's jump into the what actually worked in our Justin Freeman of Run the Sims actually chopped first place. So that is very exciting because we've been pushing the Run the Sims. And if you relied heavily on the Run the Sims projections and the optimal rates, you probably had a very big week. So going through it, winning lineup was Max Captain, Lando, Bottas, Yuki Tsunoda, Sebastian Vettel, and then the Red Bull constructors. So as we mentioned, the thing that really pops out is getting that kind of mid-salary build with Lando, Bottas, and Seb was cheap enough, but a lot of the lineups were some combination of Max, Charles, and then a bunch of cheap guys. So that was a great lineup by Justin, and I believe it was 25 other lineups, but again, we'll go into some of the specifics of Justin's strategy, not just this lineup, but a great lineup overall.
Yeah, and it's kind of what we talked about a little bit with, you end up with 4 guys falling out of the top 10, and so if you played Lando Norris is kind of the key guy, I feel like, here. Bottas expensive, but not super expensive. But if you're dealing with, like, you get Norris a little bit cheaper than you would get like a Sergio Perez or Carlos Sainz, and he obviously didn't perform better than Sergio Perez, but that grand and a half difference between those two guys probably allows you to be able to also have Bottas, as opposed to maybe if you you would have to do Carlos Sainz if you have Max and Red Bull.
Right.
So it'd be Carlos Sainz, and I do think that's almost around. I'm not off the top of my head sure what Sainz's price was, probably like 9,600, somewhere in 9,500.
Sainz was, where is it? Sainz was 10,000.
10,000.
Yeah.
So you get $2,000 there that can definitely get you a Bottas, and instead of having to play Tsunoda, Vettel, and Albon, which Albon would have got you 6 points. Like, he beat his teammate, he finished the race. Like, those 6 points that Albon's going to get you a lot of weeks are going to win. Like, if Charles Leclerc finishes ahead of Lando Norris, then it's probably a Verstappen. It's probably a 1 million way chop between, Verstappen, Leclerc, Albon, Tsunoda, Vettel, Red Bull kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, that's really what stood out to me, was Lando just ending up having another great race at Imola and being such a value play compared to the other things that you could do. Like, I don't think there was, I wonder what the best lineup of Verstappen and Sergio with someone else as the constructor would have been, like what the ceiling in terms of placement would have been. But that's why, like, another thing is you can't underestimate is how much the constructor really, really does matter.
Yeah.
And that's like we talked about in the last race, where Ferrari almost ended up being the number one constructor, even though Sainz didn't finish the race because Leclerc was so dominant in that race. And in this case, like Red Bull getting 62 points, if you played anybody else, even if Leclerc had finished second or third in this race, like Red Bull's still going to crush as a constructor.
Yeah, and that's why even though the last couple weeks have been kind of chaotic, we did have a solo 50K winner in their last race in Australia, and this was a 24 or 25 way chop or whatever. I still wish DraftKings, if they're not going to adjust the driver's salary, I still wish they would adjust the constructor salary, because right now everybody is just playing Red Bull and Ferrari. They combined, again, right around 80% combined ownership on those two constructors, and we're going to have a race where Max or Charles where they both don't finish, and there's going to be a weird roster construction that works, but it's just there's just so little incentive right now to get off of those lineups, at least in a significant portion of your lineups. Like if you're playing 100 lineups, you're still probably playing Red Bull and Ferrari, and probably 100 of 150, if not more. So I would like to see DraftKings raise the salary on the constructor, but there's no point in crying over the things you can't control. So we're just going to keep working with what we can work with. But some notes on Justin's winning lineup and Justin's strategy as a whole. One of the great things about DraftKings is if you are really trying to get good at DFS, you can extract the CSV of all of the lineups and look at every lineup that everybody played. So we are able to quickly look at Justin's 150 lineups, and I have some notes on what he did. But just from his lineup perspective, why this lineup was good, you were kind of talking about the salary, and we've talked about leaving salary on the table, and this lineup gets contrarian by getting off of a Max Charles build. So it's not leaving $1,000 or $1,500 on the table, but it does still leave $400 on the table. And I think a lot of DFS players are still going to look at that and say, well, who else can I get up to? Again, that mid salary build, instead of just a pure stud and dub with Charles and Max, is I think the big difference here. And I mentioned I went into Justin's portfolio from the CSV that you can extract, and 35% of teams in the field had Max and Charles in a lineup together in some format. So automatically, if that doesn't hit, you're taking 3,500 to 4,000 lineups out of the equation, out of 11,000 lineups. So you're just, if that doesn't hit, you have a leg up on over a third of the field. Only about a third of Justin's teams that had Max as a captain flex Charles. So it's not that he wasn't using those combinations, but he gave himself so many outs when it doesn't hit. 2/3 of his teams that have Max as a captain don't have Charles. So if you do that, if you are playing 250 lineups, you're more likely, you're not going to be able to cover all your bases, but you're going to land on this type of combination if you're actively trying to figure out ways to not have Max and Charles together, which I just think was a very sharp strategy, because we do have 4 weeks of data after this race of what the field is doing. And if we look at all of the teams that had Max and Charles together with one of them as the captain, on average, all of those different combinations were duped 88 times. So like if you're playing Max and Charles together, you're playing for on average an 88-way chop. Mm-hmm. The most duplicated lineup in the tournament was Max captain, Charles driver, K-Mag, Albon, Seb with Red Bull constructor. That used all 50K salary. That was duped 405 times. So if you're playing that in the big tournament, if it hits, you're chopping $123. So it's like, what are you even doing at this point? If you're getting this obvious lineup where you have Max Charles Red Bull, Max Charles Ferrari, and then just the 3 cheap guys that fit that are the favorites on their team, it's almost pointless to play that lineup at this point, because if you're playing 100 lineups, $15 a pop, why roll out one that's going to win you $120? Like when the first place is $50,000. So now that we have 3 or 4 weeks of data, these are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. I think if you're plugging it in and you lock those 3 in, whatever combination of Max Charles, Red Bull, Ferrari constructor, and then you just click 3 cheapest guys, like that's not going to do. Maybe you'll chop for $500 or something. But in smaller tournaments and smaller fields, if there's only 100 people in the tournament, or if you're playing like a 10-man or something, sure. But at this point, it doesn't make sense to be playing these lineups in large fields.
Yeah, that's fair. There's a question in the chat that I have no idea how to answer, so I'm going to ask you because you would know much better than I would. I'm going to throw it up on the screen here. It says DK needs to change the format to make it less likely to dupe, which I think we both agree with. Have you crunched any numbers to see if it's plus EV to dupe yourself in order to cash higher if the line hits?
So we actually, I don't remember if we talked about this on the show with Justin. I think that there might be some. It might be not a horrible idea to run out some trains. And what that means is just if instead of playing, say you're playing a 20 max lineup, playing just four lineups, running them out 5 times. I think in the biggest tournament, if you're going to be playing 150 lineups, I think there are enough combinations where you probably don't need to do that, because if you are using something like the Run the Sims and doing what Justin did, and if you look at, you can go to the CSV, you could download all the lineups, look at the players he used and compare it to the Run the Sims optimal rates. Like, he was almost perfectly on par with that, and it just absolutely crushed. So if you're doing something like that, I think if you're playing 150 lineups, you want to give yourself the chance at that solo 50K. We're playing for $50,000, so you want to maximize your chances at that. If you're playing something where the field is only like 500, or even if you're playing like the 100 man, like 333, I think you can make the case with the smaller the field, you can play a few trains. So we're not going to get DraftKings to change. I think we just kind of need to change our thinking. Instead of trying to maximize our points and maximize our projection, I think we should maximize the number of unique lineups that we're creating, whether that's leaving salary on the table, whether that's getting away from Max and Charles combinations. That should be your primary focus. Like, how can I get the most unique lineups or the least duplicated lineups? And I'm not saying if you're playing 150 lineups, like, I'm going to have, like Justin did in his portfolio, we're going to have a fair amount of Charles and Max combos, but like the most obvious ones, stay away from the top 3 or 4 most obvious ones if you're playing for that 50K, because I don't want to chop $100. That's dumb.
That's, I think, a reasonable way to answer that question. Yeah, I wasn't sure about it, and I did play that optimal lineup, and I think that was the only one that ended up making me it cashed. It cashed. It didn't put me in the black for, I play the cheaper league. It still didn't put me in the black for what I did, but yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. If you're playing a ton of lineups, like 15 to win $120, when you're going to have to play fewer than obviously like 10 lineups, you're only going to have to play a handful of lineups. It just seems to limit your possibility for winning if you're going to play that very obvious lineup. And I think, as we've seen, like, if you play it, it would have ended up winning and chopping a million ways. But like we said earlier, I think we said it on air. Don't remember if we said it on air or off air, but we've only had one race this year where Ferrari and Red Bull locked out the podium, and that was in Saudi Arabia, which was supposed to be the unlikely
the least
race,
predictable,
the least predictable race. Thank you. The most unpredictable race is the phrase I was looking for that I completely blanked on. And so, as we've seen, like, through 3 of those races, and when you have a driver like Leclerc, who is exceptionally talented and the fastest or second fastest individual car on the grid, but is inexperienced in a title chase, and we've seen Red Bull has had some reliability issues, like, through 4 races, we've seen what the possibilities are going to be for things to go wrong. And I think, like, if we've learned anything, you have to plan for those contingencies and start diversifying the portfolio if you really want to win a lot of money. It might maybe end up be a boom or bust strategy, but like, if you end up winning $50,000, then you're maxed out. Like, it's a couple grand, more or less, like a couple grand that you can bet a week, and there's 22 races. So if you win the 50,000, if you play all the max possible lineups and you win 50,000 once, you're in the black for the entire season.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I get where you're coming from.
Yeah, and again, I think I wish DraftKings had the full lobby right now because I haven't really looked at what they're offering in terms of cash games and leagues. But if they are rolling out like multi-entry 50-50s, like by all means run trains in that, get these chalky lineups. You know, if you could play 150 lineups, like, you know, run them as many times you want in a 50-50 or a double up. That definitely makes a ton of sense. In these tournaments, I think maybe counterintuitively, I think it might make sense running some trains in the smaller fields. And when you're chasing this 50K, I think you want to maximize your opportunities to hit that 50K. But if you're playing for $1,000 and the field is only 1,000 people, yeah, I would definitely encourage experimenting with running some trains. I want to bring up one of these questions. Can you bring up that last question from Samuel Campagna or whatever? Do we know the percentage difference by deducting $100 increments by salary? If we're talking about the changes in dupes, I've been posting every single week what we're seeing in terms of duplicated lineups by salary, and it looks like kind of that sweet spot where the diminishing returns versus like not having any more dupes is somewhere probably in that, like, leaving $1,500 to like $2,000 off the table. That's where, like, if you're leaving more than that, you're probably leaving too much salary on the table and just you're getting unique lineups, but you don't need to leave that much more to get unique. You're just making worse lineups. So I would look for that $1,500 to $2K off the table. Kind of seems to be that sweet spot. But thanks for the questions. It's fun you guys are getting in here because you know that's what we're here for.
Was the Jeff Hicks answered this question, we think, but just to clarify, was the winning lineup the optimal lineup? Do you know?
I mean, if optimal,
I can't imagine there would have been one that wasn't, but I don't know if you knew offhand.
I mean, if you're talking about like optimal from like a lineup generator, it's typically going to max out your 50K, and that lineup that was duped 405 times, that's what the optimal would have looked like. That Max Charles, what was it? Max Charles K Mag, Albon Seb, that would have been your optimal in a lineup constructor. And Justin's working on a lineup constructor for Run the Sims, so keep an eye out for that. Looking at ownership and again, just looking at what Justin did. Again, the big thing was Yuki at 18%. That was huge. But if we look at that combo of Valtteri and Lando, Valtteri was at 23%, Lando was at 27%. So that's basically the pivot right there off of Charles Leclerc. He was at 59%. So again, by going down to Valtteri and Lando instead of Charles, you get two guys sub 30% instead of a 60% guy, and then it also gets you off of that Albon K-Mag combo. Both of those guys were in 40% of lineups. So just a really, really great pivots all around here by Justin.
Yeah, and I think like that's going to be an important strategy going forward. I mean, like we said earlier, it's what we've learned about this is the lineups that, okay, well, if, and I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. If, you know, you can get Valtteri and Lando for like 23 and 27, and salary wise, they're not going to be like, it's doable, I guess. Like obviously guys of that quality, it's not going to be an even salary match for Charles Leclerc because they're two of the, like, you know, mid-tier guys, a little bit higher, but at the same time, like, you know, if you get those two guys, you know, Valtteri's like 68 or something like that, Lando's 8, so you're paying like 14.8 for two guys who are good drivers, and Charles is 11 or whatever it is. You know, those are going to be the kind of decisions that you probably need to start playing more and more because that's going to be the way that you're going to make money.
Yeah. One other note that I wanted to make on, actually a couple more notes I wanted to make on Justin's lineup. I skipped how he stacked. He had a single stack, a captain and constructor stack. We've seen that win in 3 or 4 races. That doesn't mean you should exclusively be doing that. In what I've been doing every week, and again, what if you extract Justin's lineups from the contest, about 50-50 captain constructor versus non-captain constructor. So yeah, it's been hitting, but there's a lot of scenarios where captain constructor can win. So I would just say be cognizant of that. Don't be blindly stacking those. You should still be having a stack. I still think a double stack is going to hit soon. I had a couple double stacks built this week. I think that's a strategy you want to be used sparingly. But I think probably I would say 100% of the time, stack your constructor with at least a driver. I just don't see a reason not to do that. So, but you don't always have to stack it with your captain. And then just some quick notes on Justin's lineup. By getting off of Leclerc and going to Lando and Bottas, he was able to lock in not just 5 players or drivers that beat their teammate, but also 5 top 10s. That's not always going to be the case. Just sometimes, just depending on how the grid ends up. The Albon +5 plus Charles second place is going to be more valuable than chasing those top 10s. But this week, it worked out. So I thought it was a really good example of pivots. But again, just go into and think about it from a portfolio sake. And I think the notes we touched on there are really interesting.
Definitely. I don't have anything to add to that.
Cool. Well, I mean, I'm really excited for the coming races because we have 4 weeks of data now, again, which a lot can change, but I think we're getting a really good grasp on what the field is doing. And again, check out my Twitter for that and how we can combat what the field is doing, what DraftKings is going to offer it. If they don't change salary type things next week, I just don't think it's going to happen, especially with with us having a 50K winner with some things just like a little bit of chaos. I have a feeling they're not going to change much. So let's work with what we got and really attack it. I'm really disappointed that they didn't give us a really big at least a $250,000 prize pool for Miami. They actually lowered the prize pool for the main GPP. Like, it's a U.S. facing race with U.S. friendly time. I was hoping we would get some really big contests. They haven't added. Maybe they add some. Maybe they bump the contest size on those medium sized contests. That would be fun for the average player. If the $1 and $4 contests are a bigger prize pool, that would be a really nice consolation. So if anyone from DraftKings is listening, help us out on this Miami race. We could show you guys how important F1 can be to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting. It's a new track, as one of the viewers OA mentions. It's a new track. Nobody has any idea what to expect, and that's been kind of one of the fun things about doing this all year. Is first race of the year in Bahrain, new cars. We don't know how they're going to react. Second race of the year, Saudi Arabia is supposed to be the unpredictable one. Australia, they hadn't been to in a few years, and they made some changes to the track. And then Imola, you throw in the sprint for the first time there, and less upgrades than you would normally get for the first European race, because now you're going to Miami for the first time ever. So every race this year, we've had new variables and things like that. And it's going to be a hard game to beat for people because every week so far, there's been a different added little bit of wrinkle to it. Yep. And we're not going to really have an idea of obviously you should expect going into Miami that Red Bull and Ferrari are probably going to be the 2 best teams out there, but who the hell knows what's going to happen once they get on track on Sunday. Obviously you can just do what you can in qualifying and make the best judgments that you can. And if one guy is 3 seconds faster than, or 3/10 of a second faster than anybody else in qualifying, the way Leclerc was in Australia over everyone, then that's probably the guy that you want to put to back more than anyone else. But we have no idea. And 3:30 race time, right? Eastern for Miami on ABC. Like, they don't put these races on. I think they did one race on linear TV last year as well. Like, they don't put them on linear TV, but in a nice Sunday 3:30 time slot. It is a great opportunity for not just DraftKings for fantasy, but for sports betting and all of that kind of stuff, to see what we get for just an audience perspective and more people interested in playing it, instead of you talked about it and you were up. It was funny. I got a message from you on Slack at like 5:30 in the morning or 8:30 my time. You were awake and ready to go, but for a lot of people on the West
Coast,
I
was still in bed, but most people aren't.
And it's your livelihood. Like, if you play this, but it's not your livelihood, man. If you're on the West Coast, like, Formula One kind of locks you out most of the year, where it doesn't when we're doing this race. So come on, DraftKings. This is an impassioned plea. More offerings, more bets to be made, although DraftKings does do a better job than some of the other ones in terms of the variety of things, and they do race parlays and all that kind of stuff. But more contests, bigger prize pools. Let's go. Couple times a year. Do it in Miami, do it in Austin. The rest of the year you can kind of do what you normally do. But when it's in the States, you have Americans tuned into this, the way that this sport is growing in this country, it just makes too much sense to not do it. So that's what we're asking. Please, DraftKings.
Yeah, and if you're on the West Coast for those non-US races, you can always just go with the aggressive option and just try to find the bottom of that whiskey bottle up until the race starts, and then go to sleep after the race. That's it's a Sunday. You can just sleep all day.
Exactly.
Before we get out of here, you threw out a bunch of betting props and bets that absolutely smashed. And why don't you go over those bets that hit?
Just remember, folks, scared money don't make money. Scared money don't make money. And I was a little scared to bet on all of my bets. So I ended up only betting 2 of these. And of course, I bet the one that didn't win. But I said George Russell top 6 at plus 195. That basically cashed on the first lap of the race. Sebastian Vettel to finish in the points at plus 270. That's the one I'm kicking myself over. Like, Russell to finish in the top 6 needed a lot of things to go his way. They did. Lando Norris to finish on the podium at plus 500. We obviously needed Charles Leclerc to make a massive mistake late in the race for that to go our way. Sebastian Vettel finishing in the points plus 270. I was just so worried about the pace that he showed in the sprint, which really didn't end up mattering at all. And obviously the wrecks and everything helped him move up. But that one I was kind of kicking myself over. But I did mention Lando Norris, a podium finish at plus 500. Sergio Perez, fastest lap, plus 500, also did not cash. He had a fast car. Max Verstappen had the fastest car. But Max Verstappen was all the way down to, I said, minus 125 when we did the preview show. By race time, he was even money, which baffles me. I want to know who steamed Leclerc or someone else in that moment when so I ended up having to, you just have to at that point. If you're going to give me Max Verstappen when he was clearly the best car in conditions that were going to be favorable to him, I have no idea why that was. And then they do race props on DraftKings and a trifecta box. So if you're thinking like horse racing, pari-mutuel betting, win, place, show, they had a Verstappen, Perez, Norris, all to podium. So in any order, just all of them to podium was plus 900. I don't know what the fair price of that would have been, because I know Norris was plus 500. I don't know what Perez and Verstappen. I know Verstappen was probably like minus 310 or something like that. I don't know what Perez was. He was probably the third best odds of anyone, but just kind of fun. I wanted to keep track of it, but with Max winning the race, that kind of crushed any opportunity for any of those parlays. I will, word of advice, if you're on that, like, shout out to DraftKings for offering them and putting them out there. Most of them are really, really bad bets that are not going to have much of a chance to hit. I would think some of the small plus money ones are usually going to be okay, but like the way that it's gone this year, where Max and Charles have finished on the podium together just once, right? In Australia, in Saudi Arabia, right? Yeah, because Max didn't finish 2 races and Charles finished 6. So like that kind of stuff, Carlos Sainz keeps finishing out of the point. So be wary of them. They're fun to look at. They're fun to think about. And if you've seen one that you think has an edge or something like that, that's great. But you know, they're fun to think about. But it was everything that I thought kind of could happen in this race. If things broke a certain way, ended up happening. That's not going to happen a lot of weeks, but you know, we'll be happy with it. And I ended up betting, you know, more on Verstappen than I did on the Sergio Perez one. So from a betting perspective, it was a winning week. And that kind of put me into the black when you combine my betting and my DFS. So that was certainly helpful, but it could have been better if I had just trusted myself. But hey, it is what it is. It was a good week and a good race. And man, it would be fun to go be there in Miami. I will offer a word of caution. If you're watching our show and you are going to Miami for this race, just know it is nowhere near the beach. This track is around a football stadium. It is in Miami Gardens, not Miami Beach. It's around Hard Rock Stadium where the Dolphins play. Everything's going to be mad expensive. They're bringing in fake yachts and a fake marina. It's still going to be fun.
I have a bone to pick with the tickets too, because I signed up. You know, they had a waiting list when tickets went on sale, and then they announced them, and the whole Ticketmaster get in line thing, they sold out in like 5 minutes or whatever. Instantly, it shot up to $1,200 on the secondary markets. A couple of weeks ago, Ticketmaster and the Miami GP sends out an email that if you were in the original line to get tickets, they're re-releasing a handful of tickets to those that were online. You got to get back in line. I got through. Tickets were available. They were selling them at resale prices. I was like, oh, you guys are jerks. You guys tried to trick me. So if you are going, have fun. Send us pictures. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the preview and strategy show for the Miami Grand Prix. Again, that is that's a very unique time for usual F1. That race, the race and qualifying is 3:30 Eastern time, I believe. So with qualifying being that late in the day, probably going to be tough for us to get a Saturday show in. So we're thinking about doing a NFL style Sunday morning show, and that should be great for those that do tune in, because that means we would have had time to grind some lineups already. So if we do go with the Sunday morning show, it'll be super dynamic. We'll definitely keep you guys posted. So stay tuned for that. It'll be a really fun preview because nobody knows what the hell to expect. Just as a reminder, as I mentioned, Justin Freeman just crushing first places. Run the Sims deal. Go to runthesims.com and use promo code 4for4 for 10% off USFL and F1 projections, tools, and content for betting and DFS. If you are a best ball fan, 4for4 fan, get a free 4for4 Pro subscription by depositing at least $10 on Underdog Fantasy. Use the promo code 4for4, and you'll also get a bonus deposit match up to $100. You must be a new Underdog user. You can sign up for that in the link in the description below. Make sure you're checking out all of our plans. The 4for4 betting plan has been fantastic. We have NFL draft this week. We have a ton of betting props on that, so make sure you're signed up before the NFL draft for that. Make sure you check out the BetSperts bundle right now, available on Dynasty League Football. Get you access to Dynasty League Football, 4for4, the Fantasy Life app, and BetSperts for just $99 instead of $209. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching, and give us a like. If you are listening on any of your favorite podcast providers, please rate and review. 5 stars would be awesome. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Check out BetSperts at BetSperts Golf. Dan is at Really Dan Weiner. Check out Run the Sims at Run the Sims. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys in 2 weeks.